Welcome to another BVRLA Fleets in Charge webinar. We are here on a very cold winter's day, and hopefully you are all safe and warm. We've got a fascinating topic today to unpack, and that's around the total cost of ownership, the general cost of running EVs. You will all have been aware that there are real challenges at the moment with energy prices, inflation, and all those really tough issues. And so, what we want to try and unpack today is what's going on. Can we do a little bit of a deep dive into the issue? What can we expect? And what to look forward to in 2023. And I really hope it is something to look forward to. As per usual, there's a little bit of housekeeping I need to do, and you should be able to see a slide now. We have a questions box on the right-hand side. Please go into the sort of Q&A tab on the right-hand side of the screen and ask any questions you have throughout. We have some fascinating speakers today, and I'll be deeply disappointed in our audience if you don't ask us some challenging questions. But then, of course, since this is a BVRLA event, I must remind you of our competition law requirements. If we could just move to that slide, please. But generally, the competition law requirements mean that we can't discuss any specifics which are not in the public domain. You need to not mention any companies and their commercial information, and we'll be calling anyone out on that. And if we have questions which are in breach, we won't be asking them, of course, and sort of making note of that in the chat. But otherwise, please do engage. So, what do we have to say first? Without further ado, I want to welcome Tim Bush from UBS, who's joined us very kindly from what I've just learned is a very, very cold Seoul in South Korea, to talk us through a little bit of the global picture of what's going on here. Why is it that we're seeing the trends that we are, and what can we expect going forwards? Over to you, Tim.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. Tim Bush, and I head global battery research at UBS, and I am, as Thomas mentioned, based in Seoul. I'm going to try to get through a fair amount in 8 minutes. From a battery perspective, the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed into law this August in the United States is game-changing for the global battery landscape. And it does have significant cost implications. So there are three key concepts that I'm going to discuss. One is the consumer tax credit at $7,500. It takes effect from next year. Second is the advanced manufacturing production credit. This is a direct manufacturing credit to battery makers that is equivalent to a third of battery cost. So has the potential to significantly lower battery costs and incentivize capacity into the U.S. And then finally, this concept of foreign entities of concern. And this is really the hot topic around IRA, because China, which is the supplier of almost all of the upstream battery materials, so metal sulfates, precursor, electrolyte, synthetic graphite, natural graphite, all of these materials are almost exclusively in China, and the U.S. aims to eliminate these from the supply chain by the beginning of 2025. So a little bit more on the details. So the consumer tax credit, it's $7,500, takes effect from next year. It will run through 2031. The tax credit is the consumer can apply that to the purchase price, so it directly lowers the purchase price, and it applies to passenger vehicles with an MSRP of below $55,000 and SUVs and trucks with an MSRP of below $80,000. So it's covering a huge segment of the market. And I think that, the implementation of this program from next year is going to significantly stimulate demand, even with Europe showing signs of weakening. Now, this is great. However, there's a catch, and that relates to foreign entities of concern. So from 2023, the only requirement to receiving the consumer tax credit is that the electric vehicles are made in the United States. However, from 2024, if you want to be eligible for the credit, you cannot use any components from China, battery components. So that's anode, cathode, electrolyte separator, and so on. And if you do use China components, then you're only going to get half the credit, or $37.50. And from 2025, nothing from China. So no components, no upstream minerals, no processed materials. So the problem here is, like I mentioned, all these materials are based in China today, and it is impossible to relocate these supply chains within 2 years. So either we see prolonged phase out of China, or in 2025, very few vehicles are going to qualify for the consumer tax credit. Now, fortunately, the Department of Treasury and IRS is going to give revised guidance on this policy, and most likely that's going to come this week. And there's strong expectation that there would be more gradual phasing out of China. And this would be a real positive for costs. So I think that the less restrictive the U.S. is around upstream part of the supply chain going into the U.S., the more positive this will be for battery costs coming down. But this document is probably the most awaited document of 2023 by the entire EV supply chain, and I think most automakers. I think there's something else that is expected in this guidance, which is whether or not companies like Hyundai or some of the European and Japanese automakers will be able to export vehicles into the United States and qualify for the credit. These companies are looking for waivers. So if you look at a company like Hyundai, they've already committed $5.5 billion to building EV manufacturing capacity in Georgia. However, that capacity is not coming till 24, 25. So in their view, look, they've made the investment in the United States. The capacity is coming, so they want a waiver from now until that capacity coming online. In the event that we do see these types of waivers, I think that leads to upside for EV demand in the U.S. next year. So that's kind of the broad brush of what's happening with the consumer credit. The other important point is the advanced manufacturing credit. Now, this is $35 a kilowatt hour. The battery cell cost today is about 150. I should say the battery system cost. So that cell plus system is about 150. And the advanced manufacturing credit for the entire system is $45. So you're talking about a direct subsidy for battery manufacturers for a third of the entire battery cost. This would make the United States the lowest U.S. government subsidized global producer of batteries. The requirements to getting, and then to put this into kind of perspective of how meaningful it is, like, Panasonic has the Nevada Gigafactory. This is the earliest Gigafactory in the United States. It's about 40 gigawatt hours. So this can supply roughly, about 500,000 vehicles or so. They raised their earning guidance in the third quarter by $1 billion because of the advanced manufacturing credit for next year. And this credit is available on units of production, most likely through 2031. So it's massive, and it will incentivize huge investment into the United States. Most of this battery investment is incurring in 50-50 joint ventures. So automakers like General Motors are partnered with, Korean battery makers like GM and LG, Ford and SK, Stellantis and LG, Stellantis and Samsung. So General Motors, during their Capital Markets Day, publicly announced that they expect their battery cell costs to go to $87 by 2025. Clearly, not all of this advanced manufacturing credit is going to flow to the bottom line of the battery makers. It's also going to lower battery costs. So currently, battery cell cost is $130, and I guess with these credits, General Motors is looking at $87 a kilowatt hour. Now, in our view, that's pretty aggressive, and probably includes a view of significantly lower metals prices, particularly lithium, but nonetheless, that is a significant cost down. Finally, just a little bit on lithium and upstream metals. Lithium is the constraining factor to electrification in our view. We're expecting 50% EV penetration by 2030, but if lithium is the limiting factor, that will only reach 35%. So lithium has the most potential to have create cost inflation, and therefore we think the most important technology for vehicles is about how can we sell more electric vehicles with less lithium per vehicle. We think the best way to do this is through smaller battery packs per vehicle, and the only way for this to happen is if one, high-speed charging can happen without negatively impacting the battery life. Two, if charging infrastructure exists. And three, in many cities, if the grid is upgraded to support this charging infrastructure. So this is one of the most important kind of future investment areas in our view in the EV supply chain. So I think I would leave it there so there's time for some questions.
Sure. Wow, Tim, that's absolutely fascinating. And I think that the number one question is really the US is flexing its muscles now. What do you think that means for Europe in general, and specifically the UK, and how this will sort of play across?
Europe is the jump ball of the global battery industry. US has kind of drawn a line in the sand here that they're basically eliminating China from their supply chain. And our question is, does the Europe incrementally follow the United States with more restrictive policy as it relates to China, or do they remain more or less open for business? I think I take a view that I don't think that Europe wants to trade, or the UK, Russian energy dependence for Chinese battery dependence. So I tend to think that we will see a European version of IRA. I think that, actually Europe has the worst battery cell supply problem in the world. I mentioned all those joint ventures in the United States, which means that all of the US automakers have tied up battery supply through 50-50 JVs, but none of the European automakers have. They're basically relying on these new entrants in Europe that seem to be coming under financial distress, as we've seen with certain companies that have been in the news recently, actually quite a few of them. So the European OEMs have not tied up with any incumbents, and their own internalization, battery cell internalization plans seem to be challenging. So this leads to a question: is where are the battery cells going to come from to meet these aggressive electrification plans? So either one, Europe is going to be very reliant on China battery cell imports. Two, they're going to require the Chinese players to localize their capacity to supply Europe. Or three, and this is kind of an outside possibility, does the United States become the subsidized export supplier into Europe to bridge this supply gap? So ultimately, I think Europe is going to follow the US to a degree. I think China will continue to have a role, but not purely an export model. Maybe upside from the US in terms of exports.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And I guess in that picture, you talk about the sort of new entrants struggling financially, given the sort of massive subsidies going on in America, but then the new entrants in Europe, etc. Are we at risk of a sort of two-tier pricing system for battery packs? The US ones are just sort of in a totally different league, and sort of European batteries are much more expensive.
I mean, it's possible, and I think you can look at the Chinese market. I mean, we just got November's data for China, and you would think that with all the this competition in China around batteries, that you would see maybe the market wouldn't continue to consolidate. But now we have BYD and CATL year over year further consolidating their share with 81% market share in November between the top two companies. And the top four companies takes you well over 90%. So the Chinese market is consolidating. For the battery industry, it needs scale, industrialized scale in China, in Europe, in the United States. It needs to secure the materials. So the materials that are to feed these downstream capacities, and the incumbents have structural advantage in insourcing some of these materials and having long-term supply contracts. I think that, the Koreans also have a similar advantage. So I tend to think that what might happen in Europe is that we see, What we've seen with the European automakers is an unwillingness to pay. They didn't have the same willingness as the U.S. automakers to pay up for battery cells and allow the battery makers to get a reasonable margin. They're trying to squeeze the battery cell makers like the traditional auto parts supply chain, and this actually extends to upstream materials like lithium. I was in Australia 2 weeks ago and talking to some of the lithium producers, and the European OEMs just aren't willing. They want a 50% discount on lithium price, and it's a commodity, and they don't care if you're VW, you pay up or you get no lithium. So in my view, the Europeans need to get their heads around the fact that they are no longer the 800-pound gorillas, and they're going to have to pay up. And I think that we'll see them end up tying up with incumbents in joint ventures as well, but at less favorable pricing. So you may have slightly higher pricing into the EU than the US.
Really fascinating. And I'm sorry, Tim, that that's all the time we got. But thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure if there are other questions in the chat, we can relay them to you. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening as we start our day.
Thanks everyone. Have a great day.
So next, we are moving on to a sort of more localized picture, looking at what is the trends that have happened in the year so far. And to do that, we have the very capable John from CAP HPI. John, over to you.
Two areas that we're going to focus on today is going to be around new vehicle data and SMR and the trends that shows us here in the UK market. And I'm very sorry. Here we go. Sorry, it wouldn't click over then. Now, the key thing which I want to talk about here and look at today from a pricing perspective is looking at new vehicle pricing on a sector basis rather than looking at this on an individual model basis. And the key reason for this, if we look at it at a sector level, we can get some good indication as to how accessible EVs are to consumers in the market. Now, if we look first of all here at the overall trend that we've seen over the years, what we can see here in the dark blue line of being the electric vehicles is that the delta of electric prices to ICE has grown, and that's continued to grow. And we're not seeing that close massively at the moment. The key reason for this is OEM strategies have been to launch more premium EV models into the UK market. So this has caused this growth. Key thing to say though is this is not the same for every single sector, and trends differ. If we look at city car, for example, you can see here the EV price has remained fairly static. What we started to see over the last couple of years is the price of petrol vehicles continuing to increase. Now, if these trends continue, we'll achieve price parity in about 2 years' time for this sector. Now, admittedly, city car isn't the one with the biggest volume in it, and there are not as many models that we actually have here. So let's look at lower medium. Now, if we're looking at lower medium, we have a lot more players that are playing in this area here and a lot more volume which comes through this sector. We have vehicles such as the ID3, Ioniq, Leaf, and G4, and more recently the Funky Cat in here. And so there's more vehicles coming all the time. You can see similar trends though to what you just saw in terms of the ICE prices continuing to increase both the diesel and the petrol, whereas EV is remaining fairly static. Now, as more investment will come into this sector, my forecast for this is parity across the sector will be achieved within 1.5 years, and it may be a bit sooner than that. These trends are continuing to go in one direction and don't show signs of changing. If we look at the SUV sector, you see a similar trend for large SUVs with a slight difference. With the large SUVs here, what you can see is that there was a big drop in price around about 2019. And this would probably coincide with when we started to see more OEMs launching models into this sector. Since then, it's been fairly static, but diesel prices have been rising. So reaching parity here for this sector is coming up very soon. If we look at medium, where we like to buy a lot of cars in the UK, you can see a different picture, and the same for small SUVs. The parity, the delta is growing, so they get further apart. Now, the good news is, I don't see this continuing. This will change. There's a lot more investment coming into these two sectors. Now, the key things we don't have at the moment in these sectors are many mainstream manufacturers. They're not really playing in these areas yet, but they have plans to do so. So we'll see more mainstream vehicles launches into these two sectors, which will bring down that average price. We also have more Asian brands coming to the market, and again, these will lower that price point. And we've actually got a reduction in premium brands into small SUV, as some have said they will be exiting that sector. So what all of this together will actually start to do is start to bring that price down and make it more accessible for more people wanting to come into that market. Now, what we also do in CAP HPI is we monitor leasing company spend across SMR. And so we look at this across the majority of the industry. Now, data in this space has traditionally recently hasn't been that great, but we are now starting to see the data volumes increase, and we're able to start now seeing certain trends in what's actually happening here within this area. So first of all, if you look at the overall SMR cost, what we can see is that ICE is 20% higher than electric. So ICE is more expensive in terms of SMR, and I'm sure many of you on this webinar will be aware of that. The key reasons for this is EVs have less things to go wrong. So there's not as much to fix, as much to maintain. You don't have oil changes, for example, less filters, so you have less labor rates. Braking, of regenerative braking, decreases brake wear, so you have less spend on that there, and you have time service, usually time service only service schedules that are required. The key point to highlight though is you do have higher tyre costs, both as a proportion and also potentially as a cost. And so this is an area which I really just want to highlight to make people aware of and to keep an eye on. Now, this graph here on the left is showing you the number of tyre changes cumulative through the lifetime of a vehicle, and along the bottom we have the mileage bands as it increases in age. Now for ICE, you can see that standard line there as it goes up. When PHEV came out and we look at our PHEV trends, slightly higher and largely driven the slightly heavier vehicles, probably accounting for a slightly higher wear rate that we actually have there. Now what I'm going to do is plot on the daily data we're seeing now from each manufacturer brand. So all of them are anonymized, but you can start to see different trends here as they come through. So the first three that we put on, you can see much higher than what we've actually seen on ICE at all. So a lot more tyres are worked through. Here on the ICE, before you were hitting 4 changes at around about 50,000 miles. Here at that same point for 2 of these OEMs, you've really changed the tyres twice in the entire vehicle. You've hit 8 tyre changes. And this is because a few different reasons. Over 55% of EV models have bigger than 19-inch rims, whereas this was around about 30% on ICE. Average weight's 18% more on EVs. So you get through tyres quicker. But it's not the same for everyone. So these two here, you can see are trending much more closer to the PHEV. We are seeing front-wheel drives perform better than right-wheel drives. So if that makes up more of the models that are available, then you see less burn that goes through. But now let's just see how this looks if we put on the rest of the data that we actually have. You can start to see clear trends. The clear trend here is really that there's a higher burn rate of tyres on EVs over ICE, and that's the key thing to keep in mind here. But it does differ by brand, but generally higher. And we'll see as we go forward and get more data, you'll start to see these look less jaggedy, if you like, on the lines, and they'll start smoothing, and we'll see how this trend continues, but we expect it to be higher. Now, the final point I just want to highlight to you all is the thing to keep in mind as well is EV tyres are more expensive. So on average, plus 8.7% more expensive than what you'd have had on the ICE. And this is because EV tyres cost more. They need to be stronger tyres to withstand the higher weight, made of a higher tyre compound as well to maximise range. So they are more expensive tyres. But that price difference as well can vary massively by the model that you're actually looking at. So here is one example model, which is a fair comparison you would make if you're looking at this model of the ICE version versus the EV version. As you can see here on this one, you're looking at 138% more expensive. So a lot more expensive. So depending what you actually have in your portfolio, you could be exposed more than you may not be. So you need to really keep this in mind. So key takeaways, just to close. The lower price models are coming. So they will be here. They are coming. So the next couple of years will be very interesting. Consumers looking for an EV may not be able to actually buy the EV that they actually want. Their budget may no longer stretch over the next couple of years to the cost of the EV being more, or their model, their preferred brand may have exited that sector. So lease codes, you may need to actually help to facilitate customers into different brands they wouldn't have traditionally considered. So I think this is something you need to make sure we understand the benefits of EVs and also the benefits of individual brands. And tyre budgets, you need to monitor them. And here you could have an opportunity or a threat. Can you negotiate better discounts with tyre manufacturers to actually bring down your cost of delivering this and potentially protect your price points or lower your price? Or if you do nothing, is there a risk here that you may erode margin? So I think key things there to actually consider. So that's everything. So some time there, Tom, for some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, John. I guess the sort of immediate question that comes to mind for me is we often hear that we don't have enough data to make decisions around EVs and sort of really knowing their true costs, their RVs, their maintenance costs, etc. And it's really a challenging space for decision makers. I was wondering, do you think we're beginning to hit a tipping point where we get beginning to get enough good data on some key areas, and sort of where are we still weak? Just if you could unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we've got to make decisions whether we like it or not. So we're never going to be fully comfortable on the data that we have, and we've got to learn to be a bit uncomfortable with this data as we go. I think we are starting to see more data happen. So two areas where we're seeing that is one I highlighted there in SMR, that's starting to come through. We're also starting to see this more now in terms of RVs as more volumes entering the used market. So you're starting to get more data on how they're actually performing. So those are ones which will only continue to increase from now through more established models that have been in the market a while. In other areas such as battery health and things like that, that's going to take a lot longer to come through. But my advice to anyone needing data here is aggregate where you can, because if you aggregate, you can start seeing early trends, and then as more data becomes available, you can drill down into it. And also consider other third parties such as ourselves that can cut across the industry and bring together greater volume that on your own you simply won't be able to access in your portfolio. So I think they're the kind of tricks to try and look at as we move forward the time, and it will only get better from here on. I think is the key thing.
Yeah, we've had a question from the audience which is around the SMR data. Is that based on cars and commercial vehicles, or just cars? And do you see trends between the two? Could you unpack that a little?
That was only cars we looked at there. We won't have the data yet for LCVs. There's not enough electrics out there for us to actually be able to pick up those trends.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I guess the follow up I was going to say is you have quite a positive outlook for the price trend, but a lot of that, looking at your graph, is sort of driven by inflation in the ICE vehicles costs. That's one of the big drivers for parity. I guess the question here is, how much do you think that trend will continue from the sort of ICE inflationary trend as we head towards Euro 7, etc.? Are we likely to see that sort of dip off and model preferences sort of remain the same, etc., and those outlooks get further out?
I think the challenge is going to be more on the OEMs as the volume's been there in ICE and still is in there in ICE. The increase is helping to deliver the revenue. There's been protection of the EVs, so you've not been reducing the price, you've been protecting that price point. That's going to get harder and harder as the volume shifts. So the challenge is to keep that price on the EVs not increasing when the volume starts moving into it, and bringing that down, ideally, but at the minimum, just not letting that increase. That's going to be difficult. I don't see consumers willingly wanting to choose different vehicles. In the UK, there's been a trend for many years now moving to bigger vehicles, and we like bigger vehicles. So I think that's what they'd still like to do. The challenge is going to be getting the actual vehicles in those sectors to meet that demand at the moment. Otherwise, it will be forced to change, or new vehicles won't perform as well, and used ICE will continue to be a preference.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And a final question, because I'm afraid we're running out of time, and that's just, what is it that you think will happen in 2023 that we should get excited about, to try and sort of put a bit of a positive spin on this?
I think for me it's exciting because there's going to be two real big things in decarbonisation which are going to happen. One is we're going to start to see that democratization of new vehicle prices as we get more mainstream brands in and we get Asian brands entering. There's going to be more choice. It's going to happen. Hopefully chip shortages will start to allow that stock supply as well to start picking up. That's a real big thing. We haven't had that before. That unlocks it to a new audience. At the same time, we're starting to see volume flow into the used market. Now, as long as we can get the right stimulus into that used market to make those vehicles affordable, they're game changers. That starts spreading EVs to whole different parts of this country, really, that haven't before being able to actually afford that EV. So that's going to be really exciting and interesting as that starts to happen.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, John. And I'm sure you will hang around for a bit to answer some questions on the chat if they come through. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone.
So now can I please welcome our very esteemed panelists. We've got Dean from the AA, got Charlie from Epics, got Ben from Arval, and Claire from Octopus Electric Vehicles. Welcome all. So I think the classic panel start, if we can go around the room, introduce yourself, and if you could give us sort of a pearl of wisdom for what you've learned across 2022 around where we are. And I'll call you one by one. If we can start on my screen, you're in the middle. So Dean, start with you, please.
Will do. Thanks, Tom. Hi, everybody. Good to be here. I'm Dean Hedger. I'm new business development manager at the AA, working in the business services team. And from the look of the chat and the comments, there's a lot of people I know on here. So hello, everybody, and happy Christmas. Right? Happy Christmas. Pearl of wisdom from me. Well, it's got to be breakdown related, hasn't it? Seeing as I'm at the AA and EV related, because we're on an EV related webinar. So I can give an update on our stats and the performance that we see in the kind of the market at the moment. So this year to date, this is as at the end of November, we've seen 57,000 call outs to pure EV breakdowns. Last year we had 38,000 in total. So you can see there's almost an increase of 20k already, and probably going to be an increase of around 25 come year end. But interestingly, the call outs, the main reasons for the call outs remain as tyres and 12-volt batteries, and only 4% are because of drivers running out of power. We do see that increase slightly for seasonality reasons when the weather is colder, and obviously less so when the weather is warmer, but it's still sticking at around 4%. So there we go. That's my pearl of wisdom. Hope that's useful for everyone.
That's really fascinating. Charlie, over to you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. So Charlie Brooks, the strategy director at Epics OneLink. I think maybe not a pearl of wisdom, but just some insight that we've seen is we certainly had the view that EVs were going to be used for much shorter journeys. People wouldn't want to transition to EVs for those long point-to-point journeys. But actually, what we've seen is that the average mileage before a first-year service and a second-year service in an EV and an ICE vehicle is pretty much identical, which I thought we found quite surprising. We thought that would be much, much less for the EVs.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Claire, on to you.
Thanks, Thomas. Hi, I'm Claire Miller. I'm the Director of Tech and Innovation at Octopus Electric Vehicles. I guess one insight around brand loyalty is that customers are willing to consider other brands. And I think until we start to see significant volumes coming across some of the more established major brands, actually, brand curiosity is on the rise. So that's one thing that we're seeing. I guess on the energy side, we have seen an incredible uptake and interest in our Intelligent Octopus tariff, which hopefully we'll get onto a bit later in terms of smart charging these EVs. So actually we've got over 10,000 drivers now smart charging their EVs every night, which has taken us a bit by surprise because that's without any marketing or any hard push. So yeah, we're really excited to see customers are engaging with smart charging as a normal part of their everyday having an EV in their life.
That's brilliant. I love that phrase, brand curiosity. Ben, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Ben Edwards from Arval UK, so corporate consultant. Claire's just nicked my pearl of wisdom, so thanks for that. So it is.
We should have shared notes before.
It is about that the whole brand loyalty and almost the brand snobbery that always used to be around with I only want premium, and we've got a lot more entrants into the marketplace, and as we heard from earlier, we've got a lot of Chinese manufacturers coming in, so there's actually a lot of desire and demand for it. And I guess my other one then off the top of my head is probably we see 15% in the marketplace for everywhere is being talked about as EV adoption is 15%, but actually within the true fleet sector, which is where most of us are, is actually 28%. So it's a massive, significant number. And I think we need to celebrate that a lot more than what we do currently.
That's, yeah, really interesting. So to start to unpack some of the more detailed question, I guess the two mentions have already been made of new entrants, and we heard about new entrants in John's presentation. I guess sort of throwing it over to you, Dean, what do new entrants mean for your customers, and sort of how are they responding to those brands, and how does that impact your side?
We've got lots of NDAs in place, Tom, with new entrants that I can't tell you anything about. But there are a lot of names coming down the line that you won't have heard of yet from faraway lands, very much so. And we're looking to work with those brands to support them with roadside cover. But I think you can look more recently at what's going on at the moment. And some of the OEMs that have come to the fore, like Kia and Hyundai, have been breaking down those kind of brand loyalty barriers that we may have seen in the past, and maybe some of the allegiances with some of sort of the German brands, perhaps. And you've got consumers almost willing to wait for some of the fantastic EVs that those newer entrant brands are building, rather than sticking to what they know as tried and tested. I think so. That's what we're seeing at the moment in terms of new entrants.
I think that's really interesting, and I guess this is a new space with EVs, and it sort of unpacks a sort of whole new way of consuming the product. And Claire, I think Octopus EV is a new entrant in its own right into the sector. And I guess you're looking at it from a slightly different angle, coming from the energy side first as a firm, and then the car side. When we're talking about TCO and we're talking about the cost of electric vehicles, energy is sort of front and center of people's minds. But there is more to energy than just the sort of flat tariff rate, and I think there's some interesting things there. I heard recently that Octopus was paying people to turn off their power. I don't know if you could sort of unpack a little bit there about how we can try and make EVs more affordable with some creative thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are a few things to unpack there. I think, like, looking at it like most broadly across the whole of the UK, there are conversations going on right now about how can we all as individuals and as businesses interact with the grid in ways which help us do more with what we've got right now. So our good friend Graham Cooper is not on the line, but I feel he's always with us in spirit in terms of, encouraging us all from National Grid to do more with what we've got right now. And that's, really important when you have an EV as part of your business or as part of your kind of everyday kind of transport, because it brings that energy question into your home and into your business and right kind of up close and personal. And so to your point about being paid to avoid using energy, that's something that's going on across a number of energy retailers. And so if people are interested, have a look on your energy retailer's website and get out there, because lots of them are starting to engage with that. We bring it into the kind of Octopus world of tariffs. On the energy side, we pioneered EV tariffs. We had something called Octopus Go, which still exists, which is cheaper overnight to charge your vehicle than it is to charge and use energy during the rest of the day. And actually, that's been around quite a few years now. And the idea there was to those early adopters to get them using energy at a time when it's cleaner and it's cheaper for the grid. And what I mean by that is that in the UK, we're moving to a grid which has a lot more renewable energy on it. So wind and solar and other ways of generating energy that's clean. And actually, often overnight, there's more generation than there is consumption. And so EVs are a brilliant place to store that energy. So we've been doing a lot of work thinking about, these are vehicles. And as a leasing company, obviously, we're thinking about them as ways of transport, mobility and others. But we're also thinking about them as batteries on wheels. So actually, as we start to move into this high kind of higher penetration levels and higher adoption levels, and that's a really that's a brilliant stat, Ben, to call out. I think that's absolutely brilliant to hear that like larger number in the fleet world, which is so important obviously for that secondhand market in the future. Actually thinking about how we use energy, we have something called Intelligent Octopus, and what that does is allows us to kind of look after your charging. We make sure your car is charged at the right time for you in the morning. And overnight, we pick the cleanest and cheapest times to charge your vehicle so that it can also help the grid. And we can do that automatically. And that means we can give you our cheapest rate overnight. So that's 6 hours at 10p per kilowatt hour right now overnight. So if you think about that in the total cost of ownership kind of context, that means it's shifting your charging to a time when you're probably not going to be using your vehicle for most people, and the majority of businesses. There will be some that need to drive overnight, but the majority, that means you can move your charging to a time when it's cheaper. And that is important to bake into those overall considerations about how much it costs to charge the vehicle. And then I suppose my final point, which some of you will know, vehicle to grid is super close to my heart. So I spent 4 years thinking about vehicle to grid, which is kind of has always been coming and is still coming. But I think 2023, I'm very hopeful we'll start to see the first kind of production road vehicles coming to market with CCS enabled vehicle to grid. And that will expand even further the opportunity for people and individuals and businesses to get involved by exporting some energy out of that vehicle when they're not using it. They get paid for that and then charge it up when it's cheap. So yeah, there's a whole world of smart charging that's coming, and it's really important if you're using EVs in your life or in your business, because it's going to save you money and make it cheaper overall to run those vehicles.
I think that's really fascinating that you're able to see you'll be able to leverage your energy use to be able to make your EVs more effective, more affordable. I guess, Ben, the question though is, how is that sort of traditional TCO picture stacking up for BEVs now that we've got these increased energy prices? Or is traditional TCO no longer the thing to look at if we're looking at more dynamic energy pricing and that's the future?
No, I mean, that's a very good question. It's something that we get asked quite a lot with corporates. And I think there needs to be that understanding that a TCO, or whole life cost, still needs to be the backbone of a vehicle choice list for a fleet. Because although it's okay to look at an individual vehicle, so if you were picking out individual drivers, when you're actually looking at a fleet of drivers, you need to be looking and providing that HR choice. You can't just pinpoint because you're doing this amount of miles, you're doing that. So it still needs to have some kind of structure behind it. And obviously we've always had that issue with petrol and diesel. It's always cost different. Across the country, it's always been different prices. If you went to supermarkets, it's going to be different. And we're going to have that with energy usage. So whether you can get it for free, you can get it, at a cheaper rate, or you're paying premium for it. There is always going to be that difference. So there needs to be, some sort of methodology that sits behind it. And TCO still, works very much for it. And don't forget, we've had all the price increases. So it's not just been on EVs, it's been on all vehicles. We've had discount reduction, which is actually kind of favoured some EVs because the discounts weren't particularly on EVs in the first place. So actually that's actually inflated some of those petrol diesel vehicles, so benefited it. We've obviously got the VED coming in place. So I think what we're getting to at the moment, and I think is really important, and some of the discussions that have gone on earlier, is if you look at some of the vehicles that we're in now, or especially if we've had them for a couple of years, we had a choice of a very small vehicle with a short battery, or we had premium vehicles with a large battery. And obviously those that were doing the business mileage went for the large battery. So that was your choice. Where now you've got a load of manufacturers that are filling that middle gap. And we're going to start to get a lot more of that. So for that kind of business choice, what we need is some estate vehicles, because engineers are suffering at the moment. There's kind of one end of the spectrum at the moment, and that's it. So we're going to start to kind of hopefully see manufacturers bring the right models in, but TCO does need to be that kind of backbone of all that vehicle choice for fleets.
That's really interesting, and I guess at the core of TCO, one of the elements is the maintenance side. And Charlie, what are the trends and the sort of changing trends that you're seeing from the sort of maintenance side on BEVs, and how this is sort of impacting cost?
Yeah, so I think you've also got to remember that there's some kind of macro trends. I think everyone starts looking at how are EVs different to ICE vehicles, but then covering all vehicles at the same time is the fact that vehicles are just getting more expensive, more complex. I mean, the proportion of jobs we've seen kind of involving electrical systems, diagnostics, and bodywork has kind of tripled as a proportion over the last 3 or 4 years. And that's just reflective of those vehicles being more complex. Overall, every kind of dent and damage is impacting a sensor or a camera somewhere or another. I think an important aspect on TCO as well, not just on SMR, is that for EVs, we've seen a much lower vehicle off-road time as well. So when the vehicles are going in, they are being turned around and put back onto the road quickly. And for those kind of fleets that Ben mentioned, or kind of corporate fleets where you want people on the road day in, day out, that's a huge saving that is often kind of overlooked when we just talk kind of more narrowly about SMR. And then the final point, I think, is just echoing what John spoke about earlier regarding tyres. I think we see on average each EV tyre is about 2 inches greater in diameter than ICE tyres that are being put onto the vehicles. And that translates roughly to kind of them being 70 quid more expensive. So I think don't get overexcited about some of the SMR reductions, because there are also tyre increases that you need to be well aware of. And I think my final point would be these vary hugely by make and model. For some models, it seems that EVs will be actually slightly more expensive over a kind of 3-year, 30,000 mile times kind of period, whereas for others, they're much cheaper. So you've got to be really sharp on your data to kind of acknowledge what those differences are going to be.
No, that's fascinating. And we've had a question from the audience around stated range of batteries versus actual range of batteries and how you account for that. And our first person I'd like to sort of talk to a little bit is Dean, because you were saying about winter impacting the number of calls you get. And I guess there's something going on there that I see a lot of my LinkedIn around. Will I get to destination X in this weather with my vehicle, and people posting pictures of their apps, etc. How do we need to treat that? It feels like as an industry, we often sort of the EV groups are sort of accused of preaching to the choir. How do we get the message out there and around that sort of challenge?
In terms of the Matt's question there, like you said, which leading on your question to me around TCO cover and stated battery range and actual battery range. Time of year is also a big factor in that as well. There are a lot of impacts on the vehicle in terms of its efficiency, depending on the conditions that you're operating that vehicle in. And when you look and you broaden out from cars to look at commercial vehicles, you're very much looking at type of use considerations as well. Are they fully laden? Are they empty? Do they need to tow? There's an awful lot of considerations that need to go into the calculations into whether the EV is right for you. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's a fair response. And I guess making EVs right for people, do you think, we saw in the autumn statement a comment that we're going to have VD from 2025, which suggests that the market will be ready by 2025. Do you think there'll be enough EVs which are right for enough people by then for things to sort of progress smoothly?
I think it depends on the impact of taxation on those vehicles and the changes that we see coming down the line. I mean, we do understand that vehicles need to be taxed, and the EVs in particular will catch up to some degree in terms of how ICE vehicles have been treated to now. We've, financial costs of shifting to EV is very much something that AA members are. It's stalling them from making the decision. We did a survey recently, and the cost factors around shifting to EV, around 70% of those members are being stopped from going electric at the moment. So we think that there's a lot of sit and waiting that's going to go on, in particular when it comes to individuals buying vehicles. We'll see the used market form through the fleets and companies like Claire's and Ben's that we're working with day to day, and we know, having spoken to them, that their order banks are filling up with electric vehicles massively. But it needs to be more affordable for our typical members in terms of going out and buying a vehicle. Taxation is coming, but we don't want that to stall the benefits of people taking on EVs, and it may do that in the short term. So in terms of, is everything going to be ready for 2025, I think we might see the timeline shifting slightly beyond that at the moment.
Yeah, interesting. And I think talking about delaying and putting people off, I was having an interesting conversation a few days ago around vehicle to grid, and about whether or not someone's charge point would actually be able to do it. And we've had a question in the chat which said, with vehicle to grid, how many of the existing chargers already installed would need to be replaced to support it? And I guess that's that question of waiting. People who hear about this amazing thing, what are we going to do to actually get there? Claire, I think this one's very much directed at you.
Yeah, thank you. Like my overarching message on vehicle to grid is, if you're planning to get an EV, if it's if it's the right time for you and you're ready to get it, then I wouldn't wait for vehicle to grid at this stage, because those timelines are completely dictated by the vehicle manufacturers. So although we're having lots of really exciting conversations, they are still conversations, and until those manufacturers decide to make these features available on their vehicles, then it's not real until it's real, right? That said, this is a really interesting question, because the technology, and feel free to wave at me if I'm being too geeky and too technical, but the technology that's going to enable vehicle to grid in vehicles is moving from CHAdeMO. So people may have heard of CHAdeMO, the Nissan Leaf, which is an incredible vehicle for lots of reasons. Not least because it's probably the first one that people heard about years ago, and it was the first that could do vehicle to grid. We're actually moving from that CHAdeMO technology to something that's enabled by CCS, so that combined charging standard that people will know is the Type 2 on top and then 2 DC pins below. So the charger will look different between the car and the charger, but actually the technology inside the car is changing as well. And so actually there are no chargers right now out there. I'm happy to be proved wrong, by the way. If there are manufacturers who have built these chargers already and have them on the wall, I'd love to hear from them. So please get in touch with me. But I don't believe there are any chargers right now that can work with the two different ways that vehicle to grid will work in the future. And those two ways will be, the vehicle manufacturer will either decide to upgrade that onboard charger that exists in the vehicle now in order to be able to move the energy in two directions, or they will need an external charger to be able to do that conversion between AC, which is alternating current, which is the grid current. So things that spin make an alternating current, into DC, direct current, which is what the battery needs to be receiving at the point of the battery. So there's going to be a little bit more to come on vehicle to grid in terms of the technologies. We'll see manufacturers probably going one way or the other. So some will go the slightly more expensive charger on the wall. We're expecting that to be a little bit more expensive because it will have an inverter in, versus the ones that will go with an AC charger, which will be a lot more like the chargers that we have right now, but will have upgraded power electronics, which means that the chips on those printed circuit boards inside that charger need a bit of an upgrade, but it's going to be a smaller and sort of less expensive upgrade than the chargers that will have the inverter. So probably we'll need new chargers, but by the time this becomes mass market, we're probably looking at another 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And so actually within I would say the expected replacement timescale that you would expect if you've been an early adopter and you've already got a charger. So I think it's not like it's coming overnight. It's not going to be a shock in terms of you've just bought a charger in the last year, say, and then suddenly you're going to have to replace that, because it's going to be within the next sort of 2, 3, 4, 5 years.
Very thorough answer and much appreciated. We've had another question come through, and I think this one, Ben, if you wouldn't mind taking, it's around TCO for vans and the challenges there, and how do we address them? Are they holding up, etc.? Yeah,
so vans are a tricky one, primarily because there just aren't many around. Trying to build a TCO model that only has a few models that keep switching on and off is always a challenge. And I think where cars are a business as usual now for corporate fleets, EV should be considered as any other fuel type now. It's not an alternative fuel. It's here, it's there. That's done and dusted. Vans need to be looked at very differently. As Dean said, you need to look at load considerations. What are they actually doing? Is there any, the downtime considerations? And it's a lot of it is actually being able to charge at your destination, or charge, it's changing that mindset of having to stop to charge and actually charging when you stopped. So actually speaking with your clients and actually working out whether, if you're a wholesaler to hotel chains, can you actually charge while you're there doing your delivery? And it's about businesses talking to each other and actually trying to make that work. Because I think that's going to be the next step, is the technology is not there for everybody at the moment. The ranges are significantly lower on it. LCV at the moment. So we need that technology jump that we had in cars a couple of years ago, which will filter down to the used car market in a couple of years. But that TCO for vans is a lot more complicated and is done more on a case-by-case basis rather than a broad stroke of this kind of fits most. So it's something that we're definitely working with clients on an individual basis, and no one solution fits everybody at the moment.
Yeah. And Charlie, are you seeing any data on vans and that side?
No, as Ben said, I mean, there's so little out there at the moment. I think struggling to just have enough data on cars to make real kind of comparisons between ICE to EV over the right mileage, over the right age, over the right kind of driving conditions. Vans just hasn't moved at all. I think the one thing that has been mentioned today is just, I mean, so 40% of our EVs are premium kind of brands at the moment, whereas actually across the leasing industry, it's normally 25% are kind of premium vehicles. It'll just be interesting to see where vans go on that side. Is it just going to be a plethora of premium EV vans and then going into their corresponding franchises, or will there be a whole load of new entrants, and will people actually want to adopt those as well? So I think that's the interesting piece for me.
Brilliant. I'm afraid we have run out of time. So massive thank you to everyone on the panel. Really, really appreciate it. I'm sure that everyone watching really appreciate your views. Thank you. I think I just have one quick last slide to encourage everyone around the next events. So there's more to come around the Fleets in Charge work stream next year. Lots of things to look forward to. We're going to have a deep dive event, which will be a half-day event in person. We're really looking forward to that, to sort of really unpack battery health. We've got our conference again in September, and webinars and some launches throughout. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Really appreciate it. And I hope everyone has a great day. And if you are driving around in this cold weather, stay safe. Thank you very much from us. Goodbye.